two key Trump advisors have released their peace plan for Ukraine. But almost everybody thinks this is absolutely awful. Just why is every side mad about it? And what would a better plan look like? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is a really interesting story. It originally got scooped by Reuters, which does very, very clean, legitimate reporting. But it's paywalled, so I have to use the Newsweek summary. But this is Ukraine faces ultimatum in Donald Trump's advisor's peace plan. Now, I point this out because these are two former senior advisors to Donald Trump during his first administration, General Kellogg, and let's see if I can find exactly who we go. Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg and Fred Fleitz. Now, Keith Kellogg is, both these guys are actually older than dirt. Keith Kellogg was literally born in 1944. He was a platoon leader in Vietnam. And his only high-level diplomatic experience was in the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, which you guys know is considered now by most historians to have been an absolute disaster and basically set the conditions for the subsequent Iraq War. He then was in the private sector, and Kellogg then got brought in as originally like a deputy national security advisor to Trump, and then in the and then as the national security advisor, I think for like 3 years. So again, it's got some real old dude super boomer energy, right? Like every presidential candidate and administration at this point in the country. But here's the outlines of the plan that I think are well, here's the outlines. I'll share my thoughts later. Okay. Essentially, it is a ramp up, ramp down type of plan, right? Ukraine will only get additional U.S. military aid if it enters into peace talks. And if Moscow refuses peace talks, Ukraine will also get additional U.S. aid, right? And this is meant to create a sort of incentive structure. The idea is that it creates an incentive structure in which there's an incentive for people to come to the negotiating table in good faith, right? But the plan also involves a ceasefire based on prevailing battle lines during peace talks. So it requires both sides to say, good enough, we're going to stop trying to advance, and we are going to, then Ukraine would get more aid. Okay. So sorry, I'm trying to explain, and literally me explaining the plan is exposing the holes in it. I'm trying to explain the plan and then hold it out later, but it's hard. You're probably thinking the same thing I am, right? Now, of course, the Biden administration says this is kind of a terrible plan. So do a lot of folks. And again, I think without seeing the full document, which, to be clear, we do not have the full document. That has not been publicly released. And the Trump administration has said, if it doesn't come from us, from an official administration spokesperson, or the Trump campaign, the Trump campaign spokesperson, do not treat it as official. So this may be, honestly, an effort by these guys to put forth an unsolicited policy proposal in order to kind of get media attention and to get to sort of curry favor or to show that they're eligible for an advisor position. This is actually not that uncommon in U.S. politics in general, where you have these think tanks or other advisors who will roll out policy papers that are kind of drafts of a future administration policy, and then they'll circulate them among either kind of DC intelligentsia or in the media generally to kind of build support. And they say, hey, if you want this policy, you also have to bring me into your administration, right? That's often how kind of key, very senior positions end up filled. Right? Because, right, what does a Democratic deputy secretary of defense do during a Republican administration? They sit in a think tank or at a university and write these kind of future policies for a hypothetical party administration. Okay, so before we talk about the criticisms, I want to mention you shouldn't have to cease your own operations just to get what you want. Instead, you can double down. Strike gum, 90 milligrams of caffeine in every single piece, 0 sugar. This is just the better energy drink alternative, period. So check it out on Amazon or at strikegum.com. We have the 5-pack now. So perfect if you can throw one in your gym bag, in your office, have one at home for when you need that quick energy boost, right? It's got all the caffeine of an energy drink with none of the sugar, and it's not $4 a pop or whatever they're charging for like Red Bulls now. It's crazy. So check us out, Amazon. Link is in the description. And thanks to everyone that's left us a review. Those help tell Amazon customers that we're the real deal. You know, we're made in the USA, veteran owned, obviously, and we use high quality ingredients like natural caffeine that we derive from green coffee beans. We don't use any of the weird lab made encapsulated stuff. Okay, so let's talk about the reactions to this. Again, they're saying Donald Trump's peace plan, and this kind of bothers me because it's not, and this is kind of disingenuous to call it that, right? It's an unsolicited proposal by 2 former advisors. Not the same thing, but actually this is probably what those advisors want. They want to feel like the Trump administration is stuck with this plan, and so they have to bring these guys back in the next administration. The fact that this isn't really on the books makes me think that these guys may actually have been like kind of on the outs. Even the Trump administration was like, yo, you people are idiots, right? And it's trashed by experts as incompatible. Okay. Why? Well, here's the thing. First off, a ceasefire that locks the battle lines in their current positions is inherently biased against Ukraine. As you guys know, Putin's own peace proposal was not that different. Putin said, listen, if you want us to come to the negotiating table, if you want a ceasefire, you have to yield the remaining territories of Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhzhia oblasts. Right? So the Putin himself is like, if you want to come to the negotiating table, you ceasefire on basically something that's about 80% of current battle lines. So this proposal says, well, it basically gives Putin 80% of what he wants. And the reason Putin wants this so badly is because in this conflict, and in actually all international conflicts, and actually almost all property disputes, possession is 9/10 of the law, right? Just like if you're a squatter, think of Putin as an international squatter. Once the squatter has moved in and established residency, it is very, very, very hard to get them out. And if there's dispute over who owns something, right? Let's say a piece of jewelry. You go, that you see your neighbor wearing it. You go, that's my jewelry. Your neighbor goes, no, it's my jewelry. Guess what, guys? Without some compelling evidence to the contrary, that person who possesses it is likely going to hold on to it, right? And that is true international relations all the way down, right? So if Putin knows that if he's the one who occupies this, right, and his military holds it, then there's only 2 possible outcomes for him. Either A, he has time to dig his forces in, using the ceasefire to prepare defensive positions, much like he did in Zaporizhzhia, but to the nth degree. And once he's done that, and Ukraine can't stop them because it's a ceasefire, then only 2 things happen. Putin gets everything he wants in the negotiations, or the war resumes with Putin in a way better position. Those are the only 2 possible outcomes of peace negotiations. Either a settlement that he likes, or protracted war, which he would be in a vastly better position to enact, right? So very much favoring Putin just by starting those ceasefire conditions. Now let's talk about the weird kind of aid ramp up issue. The aid ramp up issue is a problem for just about everybody, right? And the biggest problem is that, okay, let's say, again, you're Putin, and you say, all right, Ukraine will only get aid if they come to the negotiating table. And if they don't, the aid decreases or stays the same. So what's your incentive to do as Putin? You say, well, I'll do peace negotiations. I'll agree to peace negotiations, but they have to be held on the moon. right? Like you come up with some preposterous scenario where, and then you go, well, it's Ukraine's fault. I can meet them on the moon. I'm ready to. We have a space program, right? Or something other, like it won't be that ridiculous, but it'll be that unrealistic for Ukraine, right? Or they'll say, oh, as a prerequisite to negotiations, you have to withdraw from Kharkiv, right? Like leave your second largest city, and then we'll have. So then the U.S. goes, well, technically Ukraine's not in peace negotiations. But then they also say, well, if Russia refuses peace negotiations, right, then the aid ramps up again. Well, that means all you've created, all you're going to get is no negotiations, and he said, she said. That's it. That's what's going to happen, right? Because in that scenario, right, or that's what Putin is going to concoct. He's going to concoct that scenario, right? And that's sort of the problem. And Ukraine knows that even the ceasefire isn't going to happen, right? They cannot allow Russia time to build up its forces. It's like mowing the grass. If you stop mowing your grass for 3 weeks or for a month, it's going to become, at some point, the grass can get so tall, you can't mow it with a lawnmower, right? At some point, it's going to be like grassland, right? And you need you see what I mean? And that is Zelensky's fear. He goes, listen, if we do the ceasefire and we can't get to peace negotiations, we're going to be super screwed, right? Because Russia will build itself back up. Because remember, Russia doesn't need Western aid. Russia is already beating the sanctions. Their economy is growing in the face of these sanctions. So for Putin, this is an easy way to get everything he wants, right? This is clear, and this is clearly meant to strong arm Ukraine into surrendering its territory. Because again, this ceasefire plus diminished aid is going to do that. And this is the problem with the problem with the whole situation, right? Zelensky himself has said in this article that a ceasefire is a trap, right? He says there's many, when talking about the idea that a ceasefire will cement Russian battlefield gains, there's many conditions depending on how strong Putin is at the moment. Therefore, a ceasefire is a trap, right? And of course, Putin's own ceasefire conditions, you might recall, Ukraine withdrawing from Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia and abandoning any future NATO ambitions. Now, the only part of this plan that makes sense, which is why I think it was only included as a throwaway, is some kind of NATO timetabling, right? And the thing is that NATO is in a tough spot because the open door policy says anyone can appeal for membership. But membership can also be vetoed by anybody. It requires unanimous approval. So, one, I think Putin already knows that he can leverage at least one NATO member to block any new ascensions. So that's why, obviously, I think NATO is a fig leaf. It's something Putin pretends to be an issue, but really isn't. Again, because Ukraine was never really going to move into NATO membership until while it was still technically fighting in the Donbas, which it had been for 10 years at this point. But Putin needs sometimes a symbolic victory. And that symbolic victory can take the form of, listen, the United States promises we will not ascend Ukraine as a full NATO member for 10 years, right? Now, that doesn't mean NATO can't cooperate. There's actually things called like NATO strategic partners, which are NATO members without the full NATO membership treatment. Ukraine can also sign mutual defense pacts with any country it wants. So it could sign a mutual defense pact with every individual NATO member and just not become a NATO member. So again, that would be disingenuous, but Putin needs a symbolic victory. He knows that it's not really about Ukraine becoming a NATO member because that was never really close to happening. So that's the only part of a peace negotiation that sounds realistic is a guaranteed timetable pausing Ukrainian and NATO membership. And that can come from Ukraine itself too. Zelensky can sit there and go, okay, sure. If that's what you need to hear, then we'll give you X years of where we will not petition for NATO membership. And that way the deal isn't, Russia hasn't beaten NATO into taking a position. All they've done is beaten Ukraine, right? So that is why I think this is all kind of ridiculous, right? And if, as I point out to people, this is, 15% of Ukrainian territory, internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, is held by Russia. So that is about the equivalent of, like, imagine the 7 westernmost states of the United States being controlled by a foreign country. And then they go, listen, if you want to negotiate with us, you got to stop trying to liberate your territory and retake the western states. People be like, no, dude, you can't. We're not just going to let you sit in California. Especially Ukraine's additional concerns are that Russia is actually Russifying these regions, right? They are forcibly deporting Ukrainians, particularly Ukrainian kids, and then they're moving in Russians. They're issuing passports. Already, most of the people that have fled this region already are, like, the pro-Ukrainian folks have kind of fled this region by and large. So now the people that remain are more pro-Russian at baseline, and Russia is working to make them even more pro-Russian. So for Ukraine, they say, listen, if we can get the Russians, beat them back or withdraw, or get the Russians to withdraw, our refugees can return to their homes, right? And it'll look Ukrainian. But if the displaced people, sorry, they're not refugees, they're internally displaced people. If the internally displaced people cannot return, then these places going to become more Russian every single year, right? And more pro-Russian. Again, the Soviet system would literally recruit people from other oblasts and be like, oh, the Caucasus Mountains or Kazakhstan, like these areas aren't Russian enough. They're not the good people. They don't have enough of the right kind of people in them. So the Russians would literally roll up ethnic Russians and move them into these regions to Russify them. Putin's going to run the same playbook. He is running the same playbook in occupied Ukraine. So anyway, guys, I hope you see why. I'm not a partisan guy. I have been very critical of the U.S. administration and their policies vis-a-vis Ukraine, right? All U.S. politicians are dirtbags. But when you're stupid, right? So don't at me in the comments being like, you're fucking like one guy more than the other. Listen, they're all a bunch of boomers. They should all be in retirement homes. They're all pretty much terrible. But that doesn't mean they're all policies are equally dumb. And this was an exceptionally dumb one. That's all I got. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. That stuff really helps me. And of course, thanks to all the members of Combat Vet News. New site is dropping allegedly this week, assuming it's bug-free. We'll see you. Cheers.